Hey everyone, Kaitlin here. Welcome to another episode of Baldwin Breakdowns, where we're looking at big concepts, big ideas, and lots of big feelings. And this week on this episode, the feeling is anxiety, which is a big thing to try and break down in 5 or 6 minutes, and that's why I usually go over go over that time limit. But in this breakdown, I wanted to give kind of a different perspective on anxiety. And so I didn't want to focus too much on the symptoms of anxiety, like the physical stuff, the thoughts and the cognitive stuff, because I think a lot of us understand that and we can connect with anxiety in some way. Um, Instead, I wanted to talk about anxiety and how it's viewed from various perspectives. So I have kind of all my books here. We got attachment theory, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, family systems, polyvagal theory. I don't know if I mentioned that already. Kind of trauma-informed understanding. All of these ways that anxiety can be viewed from a therapeutic perspective. Loud. So it's going to be fun. I might have to rush through a little bit to kind of get through all of these, but I think it's interesting to shine light on these different perspectives. And just as kind of a side note, from my personal perspective, you're going to see me, and maybe you can already kind of pin this down, that I'm a bit more aligned with the perspectives of acceptance and commitment therapy and polyvagal or trauma-informed therapy, really understanding that anxiety comes with a huge physiological component. And I don't mean that just in the symptoms that we physically feel, but in the impact that our nervous system has on our emotional regulation, and specifically the frequency or the intensity of which we'll feel anxiety. But so let's get into it. Acceptance and commitment therapy, again, this is kind of my primary approach, something that guides the majority of my work with clients. And anxiety from this perspective is viewed as something that results from excessive experiential avoidance. And so that term experiential avoidance is when we actually avoid those internal feelings, the internal experiences. So if I know that going to social situations makes me anxious, I might avoid social situations completely, but I'm doing so to try and avoid feeling anxious. I'm trying to completely sidestep that experience. And usually this is again why this is my primary approach, because it results in this generalized state of anxiety all the time, because we're never actually making contact with that emotion. I've also found in my work that anxiety is usually an indication that some value is being threatened. So something that I say really often is we're scared where we care. And this is because we often feel scared or anxious or afraid when something that's important to us feels like it may be threatened, or we might lose it, or we might mess it up. So that's another kind of place where anxiety really comes from and might indicate. Cognitive behavioral therapies are going to look at, they have the same understanding of, how anxiety might happen. It's a human experience, it's a human emotion. There's no way for us to avoid ever being anxious. But from this perspective, the idea is that anxiety is usually maintained through kind of unhealthy or maladaptive patterns of thought and behavior. So thoughts being what they would call like cognitive distortions. So things that are kind of like thinking errors. So we might catastrophize a lot. We might think of things in all black and white. When there are these kind of patterns and rules of thought that we follow, that can maintain the intensity of our anxiety. And also behaviors. So kind of similarly to acceptance and commitment therapy, it knows that there's a lot of avoidance when someone's anxious, and that usually maintains the anxiety, but also behaviors like safety seeking. So kind of thinking of, a child with their blankie. As adults, we do things that give us this false sense of safety, and it can actually maintain the feeling of anxiety. From the perspective of attachment theory or psychodynamic therapies, anxiety is something that might arise when that kind of inner child comes through, which I can't remember if that was last week's episode or the one before. But when there's kind of that very scared childlike part of us. And this is usually going to be activated or come through when attachment bonds feel insecure. So maybe this is with an authority figure, maybe this is with a loved one or a friend, and we feel like we're rejected or abandoned. That's often when anxiety will come through. From polyvagal theory or a trauma-informed approach, trauma-informed is kind of a broad category, but in this context, and I think I spoke to this at the beginning of the episode, anxiety is often the result of a compromised nervous system. So every emotion that we experience has a physiological component, but anxiety in particular is part of that fight or flight response. And so when we've experienced trauma, when we've experienced chronic stress or strain on our nervous system, and we're kind of constantly kept in that sympathetic nervous system activation, which is that fight or flight response, then anxiety is something that we may continuously and persistently feel, or when we feel it, it is a very extreme and intense experience. And the last one I'm going to go through is family systems theory. This is kind of more thinking about like structured family systems, and when we're looking at not the internal family systems that I talked about in a previous episode, but when we're actually looking at the whole family unit and our family history, anxiety is something that can result from kind of transferred stress within the family system. So if you are a child and your parents are fighting, you as a child are going to experience some level of anxiety because you're kind of receiving this current of stress that's existing within your family system. Whew, that was very quick. Hopefully it gave kind of a new and interesting and unique perspective on anxiety. Feel free, I know I probably spoke really quickly, so feel free to go back through it and kind of slowly digest each piece, but that's the breakdown on anxiety, and I'll catch you guys next week for another episode. Bye.